He turned it down to the maximum, and it's probably got to have done it.
Yeah.
Morning, everybody. Our security team think that they may have noticed that somebody may still have a smartwatch on. Could everybody please check their wrists and make sure that they are not the one? Thank you very much. Morning. We shall be starting shortly. This morning is a level 2 hearing. Under level 2, the public gallery will be closed. Only a few accredited journalists will be allowed into the hearing room whilst evidence is being given at level 2. Everyone else will be able to view the proceedings in the annex, subject to the 10-minute delay. No one, whether a member of a legal team, an accredited journalist, or members of the inquiry staff or contractors, will be permitted to bring an electronic device into the hearing room. This includes mobile phones and smartwatches, even if switched off. This is a direction of the chair, and breach of this direction is a criminal offence. The inquiry security team will be able to arrange safe storage of any such devices during level 2 hearings. Please ask at the security desk if you have any queries. Finally, may I please ask you to remain seated at the end of each session until the chair and witness have left the room. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
So this morning's witness is Professor Rutty. May he be sworn, please?
Please.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Professor Rutty. We'd have them sitting here, please, because that's where the microphones are.
Thank you.
Can you give us your full name, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Guy Nathan Rutty.
Professor, thank you for coming to give evidence this morning. Allow me to explain at the outset that although those of us here in the hearing room can see you sitting in the witness box, Those following in the media annex will not be able to see you, nor will those watching the video on the inquiry website. That is a consequence of a restriction order that you, sir, made earlier this year.
Yes.
And it is recorded in the ruling you gave on the 10th of July of this year at paragraph 25, which, as I think I've said before, is a ruling that's available on the inquiry website.
It's available, isn't it? Yes.
Professor, I will spend the next couple of hours asking you questions about your role as the forensic pathologist in the case of Dawn Sturgess. In particular, it's right, is it not, that you conducted an autopsy examination on the 17th of July 2018,
I did, sir.
and you have provided a number of reports since that date, which we will go through together.
I have, sir.
In fact, you've provided 6 reports and witness statements which we have available to us, and I want to ask you very briefly about each one first before we go into some of the detail. So, going through them in chronological order, if we could have on screen, please, INQ 005003. This is a short witness statement that you prepared dated the 19th of July 2018, so 2 days after the autopsy. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
We see your name, we see the date at the top there. And if we could go to page 3 of that document, please. We can see, if we look a little way down the page, that you indicate, of course, that the autopsy had been conducted, but then you say that due to the ongoing laboratory examinations and consideration of the medical documentation, a formal cause of death is still pending. So, just to expand on that, the physical examination had happened, but there was still more work to do before you could reach your conclusions.
That's correct, sir.
And just dropping down a few lines, we see that you indicated that although you'd endeavour to provide a report as soon as possible, there might be a significant delay.
That's correct, sir.
This enables the body to be released, does it?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Yes, I was just going to go back. If we look on the first page of this statement, the statement is entitled Body Release Statement. Is this a routine statement where there is going to be a delayed report which allows the coroner to make a decision to release the body for burial?
In every case that was done from the unit, and it's a requirement of the Home Office, we would produce a body release statement as soon as physically possible, usually same day or as soon as possible, as in this case. The purpose of it is to allow the coroner to progress their statutory duties and at the same time to release the body to the family. And it's done in every single case in compliance with our own SO standard operating procedures and also with that of the Home Office.
Yes. So in this regard, nothing special about this statement?
This is absolutely normal process, sir.
Thank you. So noting the date then of July, we move forward to the 29th of November 2018, where you, on that date, you prepared 2 reports. If we could have the first one on screen, please. It's INQ 005526. That is a summary report we see from the heading. And let's just have the other document as well briefly. If we could just now briefly look at 5227, please. There we see the title Full Report. We'll come to look at them both in a moment, but can you just explain, Professor Rutty, they're both dated the same day, the 29th of November 2018. Why produce 2 reports?
Yes, and so I will hesitate just to think when I need to. I was instructed by the coroner to produce 2 reports. The first is the summary report, which he was permitted to read, and the second report, which was sealed, I understood that he did not have sufficient clearance to read.
So the full report contained material which was sensitive, and so this was a device to allow the coroner to have a document that he could look at without having all the sensitive detail.
Correct, sir.
So may we take it then that in this respect that is an unusual thing to do for you to prepare two reports on the same day in an individual case?
Yes, this was an unusual procedure, sir.
May we also take it, though, that in terms of their conclusions and the reasoning within them, they are identical, save for that one has more detail than the other?
They are identical, except one is shorter than the other, sir.
Well, we're in the position of being able to look at the full report, albeit with one or two redactions within it. So let's stick with that document. And if we could go, please, to page 39 within the document. We can see, first of all, at the very bottom of the page, it's signed, albeit that signature is concealed, and dated the 29th of November 2018, as I have mentioned. In fact, every page is signed and dated, isn't it?
That's correct, sir.
But the page we've come to contains the expert's declaration, and just looking at it briefly, we see at paragraph 1 there is an indication that you understand your duty to help the court to achieve the overriding objective by giving independent assistance by way of objective, unbiased opinion on matters within your expertise. Is that a duty that you understood?
Yes, all of this section is a standard wording placed within any of our medico-legal documents that I understand to be a requirement of the criminal justice system. So,
it's a standard form, but something that you understand and that you are thoughtful about before you sign.
yes, sir.
It's a standard requirement in the rules of court of both civil and criminal procedure, isn't it?
That's correct, sir.
Yeah.
We, just casting our eye down to one other paragraph of this, paragraph 3, there is an assertion by you that you know of no conflict of interest of any kind other than any which you have disclosed in your report. Was there in fact any conflict of interest in this case?
Not from recollection in this particular case, sir.
No. And I'm not going to take you to any more passages within this declaration, but if we could just look at the next page, we'll see that what is, as we have discussed, a standard form of words goes on over to the end, in fact, of the next page, does it not?
Yes, absolutely. This will be inserted as our duty in our reports, sir.
Just going back, please, to the first page of the report. If we could scroll down a little. Your name appears. We see 2 lines below that, the name of the coroner, and I think you've already indicated it was him who instructed you to prepare this, to conduct the autopsy and to prepare the report. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
We see immediately underneath his name a reference to Thames Valley Police. Help us. This was a case, obviously, in which the police were involved. Is that a normal feature of a forensic autopsy?
Yes is the answer. There'll be an interested and police force who will advise the coroner that they want to have a forensic pathologist involved, sir. That would be absolutely normal practice.
So where there is a potential criminal investigation into the death?
Where the death is unexplained, suspicious, then the services of the forensic pathologists are engaged, sir.
So again, in that sense, nothing unusual about this case, the involvement of the police?
There's nothing unusual at all, sir, no.
There is a reference between your name and that of the pathologist, that of the coroner, to a review pathologist, Dr. Hollingbury. No. What is the role of the review pathologist?
So the Home Office, a long time ago, and in fact we were doing it before they introduced it, they have introduced compulsory so-called critical checking. So every report that certainly goes to a criminal court, and it's the policy of our unit at the time that every report, and in fact many documents, are always read and checked by a second independent pathologist within the unit, so somebody not involved in the case. The actual purpose is to check that the conclusions and contents are reasonable. So they don't have to be right, and it's not a spell or grammar check. It just has to be that the individual checks that, that it's reasonable. And there's a set process which we go through, and we are it's recommended that the name of that pathologist is listed on the document. Not every group practice does that, but it's always been our policy to do that.
And to be clear, Professor, this review pathologist, does he or she take an active role in the autopsy, or do they simply review the report when it is written?
No, they take no role at all in the autopsy. They have access to documentation, slides, photographs, anything they wish, although the Home Office recommendation and requirement is only the report, and they review it. And their role is to second check that we haven't said anything unreasonable or anything that they themselves would challenge. And then once we've been through that process, it then goes out with their name on it.
And if we could look, please, at page 43 within this document. If we could zoom in on that paragraph at the top. This would appear to be a record that the review pathologist, Dr. Hollingbury, has conducted their review and has indicated that on the information available to them, the examination described and the conclusion reached in this report are reasonable.
Yes, and Dr. Hollingbury has reviewed all of the documents produced in this case as a single person, so that they in essence, because we wanted to make sure that we kept it within a small number of people, that they've looked at it and on all occasions have considered that the document produced was reasonable.
Now, that's the report then, and you've explained that in most cases, perhaps almost all cases, there would simply be one single report rather than a full report and a summary report.
Yes, it's not unusual to have a supplementary report if further questions arise, but there wouldn't be a main report and a summary report. I would struggle to remember another case like it, but that's not to say it hasn't happened. I just can't think of one.
All right. Well, I was going to come on to the reports you prepared after that date, and you've just indicated that it's not unusual to be asked to address further matters after the time that you've prepared your report. And there were such matters in this case, weren't there?
That's correct, sir.
And if we could go, please, to INQ 004495. This, Professor Ratty, we can see the date at the top there, the 11th of November 2019, so a year or so after your report. And if we just look in the main text, so the bottom 3 lines of this page, we see that this was a statement that you were asked to prepare not by the coroner but by the police. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And again, is that unusual in the context of an ongoing criminal investigation?
No, it can be asked by, because at the end of the day, and I think you've already said it, I'm neutral to any process in any form of court, and therefore we can be asked to address questions. I'm going to use the phrase any interested party, although it normally comes either from the coroner, the CPS, the criminal justice system, and the police.
Thank you. And if we could very briefly, because we will come back to this statement, but if we could scroll down to the second page, we can see in the very 2 top lines, there's an indication that the subject matter of this report or further statement is to provide a supplementary statement addressing the use of atropine in cardiac arrest and then immediately below the word comments, you provide a little more detail. You say you've been asked to consider whether Dawn Sturgess would or could have survived had she been given atropine during CPR. And you then provide 3 or 4 paragraphs giving your answer to that question.
I do, sir.
As I say, we'll come back to that. And in fact, it's right, isn't it, that within a few days of preparing that statement, you were asked to provide another one on a similar subject.
I did, yes, sir.
That, if we could have on screen, please, is INQ 004496. And we see the 21st of November 2019, so 10 days later. And if, again, because we'll come back to the substance, we could look briefly at page 2. That paragraph with the redaction in it, we see, again, you're recording that at the request of a particular police officer who's been ciphered as VN106, that was the same police officer who'd requested the earlier statement, was it not?
I will take your word on that. I can't remember, to be honest, but yes, I was asked to produce another report for the police, yes, sir.
And we can see just at the end of that paragraph that the subject matter of this statement is to be a further explanation with regards to atropine and its use in nerve agent poisoning, so developing from the earlier statement.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And then finally, if we can go, please, to INQ 005818. This is a statement that we can see from the top is dated July 2024, so much more recent.
Correct, sir.
In fact, it was signed by you, if we could go to page 20, please, on the 9th of July 2024. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And, sorry, if we can now go back to the first page. This statement was requested from you not by the coroner nor by the police, but in fact by this inquiry.
That's correct, sir.
And if we can just briefly look at the structure of this report, the title in the middle of that first page, the first section of this report is this, right, provides an update on your career and professional background.
That's correct, sir.
And then if we can go over to page 2, is it right that the second section, and we see again about halfway down the page, number 2, and the heading previous witness statements, does this section of the report, which goes from page 2, and if we could just scroll on to page 3, and then on to page 4, does this section of the report record the fact that you had reviewed all of those earlier statements that we've just looked at, and within this section provided certain points of correction, amendment, updating, and so on?
Yes, sir.
And then if we could go on to page 5, we see there at the top the heading additional evidence. Is it right that that's the final section of this report, which goes on for some pages, where you address certain further questions that you had been asked to address by the inquiry?
Yes, sir.
And we'll come back to several of those questions in due course. That completes the statements that you provided, Professor Rutty, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And noting, I won't go through them, but noting the various corrections and amendments that you've recorded in section 2 of that final statement, are all 6 of those statements true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
So there's one amendment in the very last statement, which I've identified last week, which I have alerted this hearing to, which needs an amendment to it.
Yes.
So.
And does that relate to the sort of review you'd undertaken of those earlier two statements dealing with atropine.
Yes, it does.
We'll come back to that if we may.
Yes.
But noting that, Professor Rutte, and thank you for reminding me of it, with that exception, can we take it that you are content with the run of statements that we've gone through?
I am, sir.
And so I'd ask if we could formally adduce all of those statements into evidence.
Yes, please.
And Professor Rutte, it's worth adding for the record that those of us who have read your reports will know that they are extremely detailed and contain some very useful analysis. We won't go through all of that material in court today or in the hearing, and so we absolutely will be able to use the detail in your reports in writing. But what we will do today is attempt to identify some of the more important aspects of your work, and I will ask you some questions about that. And before I get into the detail, though, may I start by asking you a few questions about your career and professional qualifications. And we can probably do that most easily by looking at that last statement, because that is where you brought that issue up to date. So if we can go back to 5818, please, and it starts on the first page. Yes, so if we can look just underneath the title, Updated Professional Background in Forensic Pathology, you start, Professor, by indicating that you hold basic medical qualifications, Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, and a medical doctorate. Is it right, or let me ask you in a different way, are you now or have you previously been a practicing registered medical doctor?
I'm still a practicing licensed registered medical doctor, sir.
And I'll ask you about this in just a moment, but is that at least now in the field of pre-hospital medicine?
That's correct, sir.
Before we get to that, just following down this paragraph, you give various details of your career in pathology. I'm not going to read it out, but we can all see that you have had a long and very eminent career as a forensic pathologist. Amongst many awards and appointments, you were or are a Fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, is that right?
So I'm a retired Fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, yes, sir.
And you indicate that you hold the Royal College Diploma in Forensic Pathology.
Correct, sir.
You also held the Foundation Chair in Forensic Pathology at the University of Leicester.
Correct, sir.
You retired earlier this year.
Correct, sir.
And you were also a Home Office registered forensic pathologist for 28 years or so from 1996.
Correct, sir.
And is that also a post from which you retired this year?
Yes, sir.
Is it in fact the case, Professor, that you have, if I can put it this way, generally retired from your active role as a pathologist during the course of this year?
I am absolutely nothing to do now with forensic pathology. I have left the practice and field, sir.
Thank you. But as I mentioned, in fact we can see at the very bottom of this page, there is also something we need to ask you about pre-hospital medicine. And if we can go over the page, you give us some detail there about your voluntary work as a response doctor for the East Midlands Ambulance Service. First of all, I think you've already indicated, but is this an area of your practice that is still current?
That's correct, sir.
And can you just expand a little on what it is you do and the scope of your expertise?
Yes, so it is unusual to have a forensic pathologist working in the pre-hospital environment. I'm probably, as far as I know, I'm the only one in the UK, although I'm not the only Home Office pathologist that assisted an ambulance service. I'm not going to name the organisation, please, that I work for, but I started assisting the ambulance service in 2009 as a volunteer, so-called community first responder, and I upgraded and I did appropriate lengthy training, and I'm now a response doctor. So I am sent out at the request of the ambulance service to assist with any critical medical event, which tends to be cardiac arrest or pre-cardiac arrest in adults and children, and any life-threatening trauma where they need advanced medical skills. I'm an assistant for pre-hospital anaesthetics, advanced drug therapies, and I have full training in all of these fields, and I literally do it I'm on call virtually every day, but I will go out several times a week to assist those who require that level of requirement.
Thank you. And we've already touched on the fact that those two short statements you prepared in 2019 were focused on the question of the appropriate use of atropine in a sort of pre-hospital context. Did you bring the expertise you've just described to those two statements?
Yeah, so I'm a trained trainer to the level of medical director for advanced life support in adults, and I train those who require that training in hospital. So I train hospital staff, doctors, to give advanced life support. So I believe that I have appropriate qualifications to talk about that subject. So.
Yes. Thank you. I'd like to move on then and to ask you some questions, first of all, about the autopsy itself. While discussing your career, we've referred to your role as a Home Office registered forensic pathologist. As is apparent from that title, the Home Office holds, does it not, a list or a register of forensic pathologists?
Yes, it's actually, that's a shortened version. I believe it's the Home Secretary's personal list of forensic pathology. I think that's its wording to that. But yes, they hold that list of people. So. And
can you help us to explain, what is the function that people on that list perform?
We're, by being a member of that list, and it's a very small list, you're in essence accredited to assist the police forces of England and Wales for the investigation of suspicious or homicide deaths. And you have to reach certain training and accreditation to get onto that list and to remain upon that list. And I was a member of it. So.
You were a member of it, as we've established, for a long time, 28 years.
Yes, sir.
And it must follow that you, in that period, conducted many autopsies in circumstances of criminal deaths, or deaths associated with the criminal investigation.
I have, sir, yes.
And I've already asked you a few questions about this, but turning to this particular case, were there not some points of similarity with many or all of the other cases that you had undertaken? For example, you were instructed by a coroner.
Yes, sir.
You worked with the police.
I did, sir.
We see that the police were involved at the autopsy, and we've noted that they asked you to prepare further reports thereafter.
That's correct, sir.
And the context, is this fair, was one of an anticipated criminal prosecution to follow.
So that may be for the police, but I approach a death as basically being a death. I treat all deaths the same. I keep an open mind as to whether it's natural or unnatural, because to go in thinking it's a potential prosecution would open you to the allegation of being biased, which I wouldn't do. And therefore, from my point of view, and I don't wish to upset the relatives, but in essence, it's a death that I've been asked to assist the coroner to look at independently and come to a conclusion to suggest a cause of death, to assist, on this occasion, an inquiry, but it could be a criminal case or it could be a coroner.
That's very fair, and as you've emphasised, yours is an entirely independent role, and you wouldn't be influenced by anything else in reaching your views about the cause of death.
No, I mean, you're undoubtedly told things and you undoubtedly have access to things, but I would hope, and I think I'm right in saying that the profession, the Home Office pathologists, approach these in a completely neutral manner. you obviously have to take things into account, but at the end of the day, you pull everything together and then you suggest a cause of death.
The point I was driving at, Professor, was a rather more practical one. Is this fair, that the possibility of a future prosecution means that you do the autopsy in a different way to how a standard post-mortem might be conducted in the absence of any question of criminal involvement?
Okay, so the answer to that is yes and no, and I'll explain why. So the yes bit is that yes, there are more people there, and yes, there will be things removed and taken from the body for examinations that won't be undertaken in every case, and that's in essence the police side of it. The no answer is that I approach a body. It doesn't matter to me whether this is a member of the public who's had a heart attack and I happen to be doing an autopsy, or it happens to be a criminal investigation. I still approach them in the same examination and the same way. You can tweak it, I think, in fairness, but I always approach it the same.
Yes, thank you. Well, sticking with the yes part of your answer, and I think you've made it very clear that we should confine ourselves to practical matters because the way in which you go about your work and you think about a case is unaffected. But sticking with the practical matters, if we could go back to your full report, please, at INQ 005227. And if we could go, please, to page 7. We see a list there of people present during the examination. Starts with you, appropriately enough, but then immediately underneath is another forensic pathologist, Dr. Philip Lum. What was his role in the autopsy?
His role was, he's another Home Office pathologist, and his role was to act, in essence, to do a so-called second autopsy at the same time. So he's there as an independent Home Office pathologist. He is there to observe everything and to write an independent report.
We mustn't confuse his role with that of Dr. Hollingbury. We've already established that Dr. Hollingbury was not there at the at the autopsy. His role was to review your report, peer review it, if you like.
Yeah, so in essence, there has been 3 Home Office pathologists who have all 3 of us look at it with different roles, but we are all independent to each other.
But just sticking for a moment with Dr. Lum's role, we see at the very bottom of the page, you're describing the inquest the autopsy on the 17th of July. You say that you were undertaking an independent autopsy, very bottom last line of the page. And then if we can go over to the top of the next page, that's it. You refer to the fact that accompanying you during the examination was Dr. Philip Lum. You say he was instructed to be present throughout the autopsy examination and to provide a second independent report concerning the autopsy findings and the death of Dawn Sturgess. What's the purpose of him providing a second report, Professor?
So he provides a second report, which I've never seen. It will be, so if it was me doing it, I would write a report, I would give my own opinion and views, and I would seal it and I would provide it. It's likely that was provided to the coroner but would not be opened by the coroner. It would remain sealed, and therefore if there was ever a criminal prosecution, then those defending the individual or whoever would be able to open that and have a independent pathologist from the time who saw everything, who was present, and came to their own conclusions and wrote their own report.
Thank you. And so it's fair to say, from what you've said, is it that Dr. Lum's role in this case was connected to the possibility of a future prosecution in Dawn Sturgess's case?
Correct, sir.
And in that regard, is it fair to say it was a routine procedure? It wasn't special to her case. It's the sort of thing that happens where there is a possibility of a future prosecution.
It was routine at that time to have a second autopsy examination. It was unusual to have them done at the same time, but it has occurred during my career. It just depends on the circumstances.
Thank you. Let me move on just to ask you about some other features of the autopsy. And for these purposes, can we go back to page 7? About a third of the way down, we see the examination date we've already established was the 17th of July, Professor. But then immediately below that, we see it started at 1:20 in the afternoon, but didn't finish until after midnight, so very nearly 11 hours. Is that usual or unusual?
So Home Office cases can take a long time. That particular time period was unusual. It was a long day. So,
was it way off the scale, or just a long inquest, a long autopsy?
I'm going to just keep it saying that it was a long day, sir.
All right. Moving on, if we could look at the bottom of page 11, please. And the very bottom of the page, you see the subtitle Autopsy Examination, Professor.
Yes, sir.
And then there is a description by you of the process. And you say, due to the suggestion that the deceased had been exposed to Novichok, the examination was undertaken as a so-called chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear, or CBRN, examination using appropriate personal protective equipment. Now, I don't want the fine detail, Professor, but in general terms, can you describe the difference that made to the process?
Yes, sir. So, as stated there, we wore appropriate personal equipment, and the process and procedure caused it to be a long day, sir.
Yeah, and one can imagine that it made everything a bit more difficult and a bit more time-consuming, at least.
I'm just thinking of the best way to answer that question. So, I think we were mindful that we just had to be more cautious, and in taking the precautions that were required, it just slowed everything down.
Yes, thank you. Moving on, but still with particular features of the autopsy, if we may. Could we go back to page 7 of this document? And back to that list of people who were present at the autopsy. We've looked at your name, Dr. Lum's name, and then further down, we see someone called QM73 from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. What role, Professor, did that individual play in the autopsy?
They observed the entire procedure, so they were present in the room and observed everything that was done by everyone. So,
can we take it this was an unusual aspect of an autopsy?
yeah, I mean, you can have an observer. It's allowed in coronial practice, and I have done autopsies before where I've had independent solicitors or doctors present or observers for all sorts of reasons. This just happened to be this individual, and I'd never met them before, and their role was to observe us, and that's exactly what happened.
Can I ask you to look at a different page? In fact, it's one of the annexes to this report. So if we could go to page 67, please. You're aware, Professor, that the OPCW subsequently published a short report dealing with their work in this country, including their involvement in the autopsy.
I am, sir.
And that's what I'm taking you to. If we look at the first paragraph, they refer, do they not, to dispatching a team to the United Kingdom in 2018 called a TAV. And then at paragraph 2, there's a reference to the TAV team deploying from the 15th of July to the 18th of July to collect biomedical samples. And then they refer to a subsequent visit on the 13th of August. And then if we look down at paragraph 5, there's a reference to the team attending and observing post-mortem or autopsy of Miss Sturgess. And it is stated that the team was able to collect a number of biomedical samples, mainly tissue samples, for transport to the OPC laboratory and subsequent analysis by their designated laboratories. So is it accurate, Professor, that that individual whose name was ciphered, the OPCW representative at the autopsy, in fact collected some samples during the course of the autopsy?
So there were at least one observer outside the mortuary environment who observed everything. There was the person on the inside who observed everything. I took the samples, which we may get to, from a predefined list that had been agreed, and then some of those samples I assume were distributed to this organisation. I didn't, from recollection, personally give them to them. I would have given them to the police in the room, and the police would have then distributed them to them.
So that's helpful. So the actual taking of the samples was solely done by you? I
was the only person, with the exception of one procedure, I was the only person who did any actual practical handling of the deceased.
But you recognise what is said in that statement about them ultimately taking samples away with them in order to test them?
Yes, sir.
Just going back to something you said, you described people being within the, I think you said, autopsy environment, and other people observing from outside that environment. Was there a room where the autopsy took place and another room that was separated by a window or a glass screen which allowed people outside the room itself to see what was going on?
Yes, it is the ultimate answer to that question. So many mortuaries have observation rooms, either within the complex or separated by glass windows. And the mortuary did have a glass window, and there was observers in the room behind that glass window. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Just finally on this subject, I wonder if we could go to briefly to your first statement, so the body release statement, so-called. So it's INQ 005003. And if we can look at the second page of that document, towards the bottom of the second page. Professor, can you see the lines are helpfully numbered, so line 36. In that very early statement, you said the autopsy examination was observed throughout by a team of independent international scientific observers from the Netherlands. Just to clear this up, is that the OPCW team we've just been discussing, or is that a different set of international observers?
No, that is the team. I was told that they were from the Netherlands. They were just there on the day, and so that's how I referred to them on the first in that first statement, sir.
Yes, thank you. And then, just finally, on the list I've been going through of notable features about the autopsy, Could we go, please, to your July witness statement? So INQ 005818, the statement from earlier this year. And within that statement, if we could go to page 13. And you see the heading there, histology, Professor.
Yes, sir.
And if we just go to the very bottom of the page, you say, due to the unique nature of this autopsy examination, 36 different parts of Dawn Sturgess's body were sampled, including skin, muscle, and representative pieces of all the major organs. And if we go over, the purpose of undertaking such extensive sampling was to see whether there was anything that could be seen under a microscope to any of the tissues sampled that had not been identified through naked eye examination. Now, we'll come back to some of the findings in due course, but just the high level, you're suggesting here that this was another, that the number of samples taken was a factor about this autopsy that marked it out from others.
Yes, sir.
You used the word unique. Is that accurate? Was it, in this sense, an extremely large number of samples to take?
It's more, it is a large number of samples, and I think it's, so I think I'll just explain that. So the first decision was whether to do an autopsy in the first place because of the potential risk. And we decided to do that. And then with the knowledge that we potentially are exposing ourselves to an agent that can kill us, we decided to ensure that we only did this once and that we sampled her to the maximum amount to get the maximum amount of information to draw the conclusions that we did. And that's why we took so many samples on this occasion, sir.
Yes. Thank you. Now, I'm going to move on now, Professor, to talk about particular features of your examination and also your findings and start to talk about your conclusions. And it's right to say at the outset, isn't it, that you were provided with a full clinical history in Dawn Sturgess's case?
Yes, sir.
And that would be completely normal?
Absolutely normal.
And we can see it recorded in your report. I'm not going to take you to it, but when one looks at it, one can see, unsurprisingly perhaps, that it covers very much the same ground that we have heard in evidence about Dawn's collapse, her days in hospital, the tests that were done on her during that time, and so on.
Yes, sir.
And would it be fair to say, just by way of summary, that the key elements of her medical history were, or at least included, first of all, her collapse on the 30th of June, the cardiac failure, the return of spontaneous circulation, and her subsequent bradycardia? Was that an important factor for you? And then, subsequently, the evidence about the tests that had been conducted during her time in hospital, including those showing profound inhibition of acetylcholine esterase and Novichok poisoning.
Yes, sir.
And then thirdly, the CT scans that were undertaken during the time in hospital showing a developing brain injury.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that the cardiac failure at the start of that sequence appeared to be of critical importance and something that you needed to understand?
Yes, I suppose it's actually, in fairness, it's the failure of breathing, the respiratory failure, which is parcelled with the subsequent cardiac arrest, the stopping of the heart. It's that sequence and causation which it underpins the outcome in this case.
So let me start with the cardiac issues. And in cases where there has been a cardiac arrest, pathologists are often able to conclude, are they not, once they undertake an autopsy, that a cardiac arrest may have been caused by something to do with the physical condition of the heart itself.
Yes, sir.
To generalise, perhaps some form of heart disease, or perhaps a narrowing of arteries which interrupted the flow of the blood to and from the heart.
Yeah, it's the commonest cause of I mean, not being rude, but everyone in this room dying naturally. Most people will die of a cardiac event, often narrowing of blood vessels, sometimes an actual blood clot in there. But it's the commonest cause of death around the world.
So knowing that there was an issue around cardiac failure in this case, did you consider that type of possibility here?
Yes, so the heart was physically looked at in the same manner that is appropriate with that in mind, and then I sought expert opinion from the late Professor Savannah, who is a recognised cardiac expert within the United Kingdom, and he provided a report for me, sir.
Thank you. So if we can go, please, to your full report. So it's INQ 005227, and within it to page 26. Thank you. We can see the heading cardiac pathology. You refer there, Professor, to selected tissue from the heart being retained, and as you've just indicated, Professor Savannah being asked to provide a report on it.
Correct, sir.
The report is part of this report. It's one of the appendices, but you've included within the body of your report his conclusions.
I did, sir.
Those being that the majority of tissues are considered within normal limits for this individual, minimal chronic fibrotic changes, likely not relevant to the cause of death, some ultrastructural mitochondrial changes which are likely to reflect aspects of the cardiorespiratory arrest rather than the Novichok agent. However, recognise that there's no database on the morphological effects of this toxin on normal human myocardial parenchyma, if I've pronounced it right. But in summary, as far as the cardiac pathology was concerned, was there anything that was found which appeared to you to be relevant to the cause of death?
No, sir.
So basically no pre-existing heart problem, is that it?
In fairness, sir, she did have some pre-existing heart pathology in as much as that she had a little bit of very minor chronic fibrosis or I'll use the word scar, but it's not strictly scar tissue. It's not scar like you get in a heart attack. I would suggest that will be lifestyle, but there's nothing there that was either macroscopically with your naked eye or microscopically or ultrastructurally of any importance to suggest that the cause of her collapse and death was a primary heart problem.
Thank you.
So that's the heart itself. If we can go, please, to pages 15 and on to 16 of your report. We can see, starting at the bottom of that page, you see the heading Internal Examination. This is the part of your report which records your examination of the, as we can see, cardiovascular system. And if we can just pass down there and on to the next page, there are references to the various different parts of the heart. If we look, for example, there's a reference just above the aorta and principal branches of the coronary arteries, and you record that the right coronary artery was dominant. All three coronary artery vessels were small caliber vessels. There was no apparent overt calcification. No significant atheroma was identified. Are those technical terms to do with the narrowing of the arteries?
Yeah, so there was no life-threatening or life-changing disease process within the coronary arteries that could explain a sudden collapse or death. So,
Yeah. Just following on down the page, with the aorta, you do record moderate non-ulcerated atheroma of the entire length of the aorta. Is that something that is relevant to the cause of death?
no, you'll see that in, I suspect, many people these days. It's a reflection of Western diet, smoking particularly, and if I recall, she was 44 years old, so at that age it's not an unexpected finding. We're simply listing every observation that, I use the word we, because it sounds like that I'm not the person, I often talk like that I'm writing, listing the findings that I'm just observing.
So I wasn't proposing to ask you many more questions about this issue of the heart. It's obviously important given the history of cardiac arrest. We've looked at the question of heart disease and the report from the specialist. We've looked at your internal examination of the heart itself, the arteries and so on. What was there? Tell us if there's any other part of your findings that we need to look at. But overall, was there anything to do with your examination that suggested a physical cause related to the heart?
Not to the heart, sir, no.
Thank you. Let me move on then to the question of toxicology. And were you aware that at an early stage of Dawn's hospitalisation, it had been thought that her symptoms might have been caused by a drug overdose?
I was, yes, sir.
And did you consider for yourself the possibility that the cardiac arrest or the respiratory failure which led to the cardiac arrest could have been triggered by Dawn herself consuming drugs of abuse or medications or any other drugs?
Yes, I did consider that, sir.
If we could go within your full report, please, so that's 5227 to page 10. And again, we have the numbered lines, Professor. So picking it up at line 218. This is within the clinical history section. You're recording what you were told and what you can understand from documents you were provided with. You record there a toxicology result was also entered. This is onto Dawn's hospital records, which showed the presence of, I'm not going to read them out, but a number of different drugs ending with nicotine and its metabolite. So there you're just recording what you'd seen in the hospital notes.
Yes, I'm just recording the list of drugs that I found when reading the notes, so yes.
Yep. And then if we go forward, please, to page 34 of your report. And so this is within the conclusion section. And that there are a series of numbered paragraphs containing your conclusions, and it's paragraph 12 that's relevant here. Thank you. So it's about halfway down. It says, in life, the deceased had a toxicological examination undertaken. This identified a number of therapeutic and non-therapeutic drugs to be present. Although I've not been provided with the levels of the drugs identified, I'm not aware that there is any indication to suggest that the deceased's collapse was a direct result of the action of either a therapeutic or illicit drug.
That's correct, sir.
I'm just picking up a couple of points then. First of all, you've made the point, and we'll come back to it, that what you could see on the hospital records were tests which indicated the presence of certain drugs, the ones we've just looked at, but not how much of them was present.
That's correct, sir.
So you've noted that, but noting that, the conclusion you've drawn is the one we see, that you're not aware of there being any connection between the intake of those drugs and Dawn's death.
Correct, sir.
And this is something, is this right, that you came back to in your July statement from this year and examined in a little more detail?
I did, sir.
And I'd like you to take you then to that statement, please, which is INQ 005818. And we will go through 2 or 3 pages of this report, Professor, where you set out some further thinking on this issue. And if we can start by going to page 10, and do you see, Professor, the heading towards the bottom of that page, consideration of the drugs identified in the toxicology examination?
Yes, sir.
And you refer back to, in fact, that's the passage, the first passage of your first report that we've gone to, the toxicology results. We've heard quite a lot of evidence in the last few days about samples being sent to Birmingham, no further detail, and then reports coming back from Birmingham, but you've provided the details of where in Birmingham these tests were sent and the results that came back. And you have recorded at the bottom of that paragraph accurately, because we've heard other evidence about this, that the results of the tests came back to Salisbury on the evening of the 2nd of July 2018. And you then go on to say, from reviewing the original report, that there were in fact 2 urine samples. Is that right?
That's as I understand it.
Yes.
Yes.
What your understanding from the documents?
Yes.
One having been collected on the 30th of June and one the next day on the 1st of July.
Yes, sir.
And you focused on the earlier of those 2, the 30th of June test.
I wanted to see the ones as near to the collapse as possible, sir.
Yes. And then you've listed, and it's, I think, the same list, or it should be the same list, should it not, that the drugs that were found in that urine sample, it's the same list as the one we looked at in the full report.
I think, in fairness, sir, there's I haven't got both side by side. It could be that is slightly different, but those are what I've identified at that stage.
I was hesitant as well. It looks longer, doesn't it? But I think you in that we don't need to go back to it. But I think in the full report you may have summarised or said, and its metabolites, and they might be set out in detail here. But
yes,
in any event, this is the authoritative list, is it not, where you have recorded what is recorded on that sample?
It's the list as I understand it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And we mentioned a moment ago that the test that came back from Birmingham did not provide detail about the amount of drugs found, simply identifying presence.
That's correct, sir.
But there is a little more to say, is there not, which you have recorded in the next part of your report. First of all, the report that came back from Birmingham referred to the fact that the sorry, you're going to have to help me with that word.
It's the metabolite of cocaine.
It's the metabolite of cocaine.
How do you
Elegantly
pronounce
done.
it, Professor?
Oh gosh.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If I may, I'm not going to say. Well, it'd be benzo. I can't pronounce it myself because to be honest with you.
Well,
Anyway, it's the metabolite of cocaine.
Yes.
we've all failed at that particular offence, but we can agree that it is indeed the metabolite of cocaine, and that, exceptionally, the report does indicate a level for that drug, and it has been the advice, the opinion is expressed within the report that came back from Birmingham, that level did not suggest recent use. Yes?
That's correct, sir.
So that's one exception to the quantification point. And then secondly, you've recorded that the report from Birmingham also stated that the mirtazapine, clopidogrel and zopiclone show large peaks suggesting recent use or high dose, acute or chronic. So to that extent, that there's a start at quantifying them, but there is no sort of scientific quantification provided there either.
Yeah, it's just make it an observation of what they're seeing on their readout when they're doing it, and they're just noting that they are, as it's that there's a high peak there, but unfortunately it doesn't provide any further information.
So what we then see going further in this report is that you have taken that initial long list of drugs and tried to think about why certain of those drugs might have been present in Dawn's system and whether some can be excluded for different, as having been potentially linked to causing the cardiac arrest. And is this right that there is a first category that you identify towards the bottom of this page that you can see elsewhere in Dawn's hospital notes were drugs that she actually received in hospital?
Yes, so I'm separating out those drugs that I can identify that were given, that basically she may have been taken whilst alive in her home. There's then the drugs that she was likely given during resuscitation, and then there are drugs which she was likely given when she was entered the hospital or beyond. And they can be, and what I really want to know is exclude those latter two groups and just try and focus on the drugs which she might have been taking at the time whilst alive, so that I can see whether they have been taken in excess and could have caused or contributed to her death.
Yep. So we see at the bottom of page 11, you've identified a list of 5 drugs which Dawn received in hospital as part of her treatment, and so for reasons you've explained, you exclude those.
Yes.
And that, I'm just looking at the penultimate line on the page, 361, you then say, so having excluded those, the following drugs remain on the list. First of all, cocaine and its unpronounceable metabolite. And then if we can follow down a list of other drugs. And then at the bottom, you refer to the fact that of that list, the only 2, the zopiclone and the mirtazapine, were amongst those that had been mentioned as being present in a large quantity.
Yes, sir.
And you also record that they're both used in the treatment of depression.
Yes, sir.
And you say that the other drugs are either drugs we see commonly on toxicology reports, so quinine, nicotine and cotinine.
Yeah, we see cotinine, it's the metabolite of nicotine. It got to the stage that you just see them all the time on post-mortem toxicology reports.
So does that process of exclusion lead you to a position where really in your analysis of trying to consider whether any of these drugs that came up on the toxicology reports could have been linked or a causative factor to the initial cardiac arrest, that really just left you with zopiclone and mirtazapine?
Correct, sir.
Just taking a step to one side for a moment, Professor, and we'll come back to this page 12 in a moment, but if we could go please to document INQ 004988 and page 50. While we get that document up, is it fair to say, Professor, that these 2 drugs, zopiclone and mirtazapine, are commonly prescribed drugs in the treatment of depression?
Yes, sir.
And what we're looking at is a page of Dawn's medical notes. I know you haven't looked at this before now, but if we could zoom in, please, on the entry for the 26th of June. So only a few days before, in fact, her collapse. Yes, so towards the bottom of that, so there are 2 entries. The 1459 entry, do we see there that her being prescribed both of those 2 drugs, mirtazapine and zopiclone?
Yes, sir.
And presumably that you would not be surprised to see that in the sense that they are commonly prescribed drugs.
Yes, they'll be commonly prescribed and they're drugs, sir.
So if we could, with that in mind, if we could go back to your report, so INQ 005818, page 12. And towards the bottom of that page, Professor, you discuss both of those 2 drugs, one after the other, zopiclone and mirtazapine. In summary, and noting the fact that you were necessarily unaware of exactly the quantification of those drugs in Dawn's system, what was your view about the likelihood that either or both of those drugs could have explained Dawn's collapse?
Well, despite the fact I haven't got any quantifications, the clinical presentation, from my experience, doesn't fit correctly for a collapse in relation to those two drugs. So I felt that that they weren't the cause of her collapse. Although I do preface that in the fact that I don't have the full information here, and that, as I often say, when in those circumstances, should that change at any point, then I will reflect upon that comment.
Yes, and that's a point you made in this report tonight. Attempts have been made to obtain further information about the quantity, the quantification of those drugs as opposed to the presence of them, but it seems that's simply not possible at this late stage. So the evidence we have is the evidence we have, and I won't take you back to it, but that passage we looked at in your conclusion of the full report, the way you put it was that you weren't aware of any indication to suggest that Dawn's collapse was a direct result of the action of either a therapeutic or illicit drug.
Yeah, yes, and particularly that, because I would expect them to not just to have suddenly collapsed in the manner that I understand that she did, but rather that it would be a more prolonged lapse of into unconsciousness. So it's a completely different clinical presentation, and that's why I'm, despite the limitations of what I have access to, I have no reason to suggest that these are the cause of her collapse.
Thank you. So I'm about to move on to another topic, so I wonder if that might be a convenient moment to take a break.
Yes, of course it would, Mr.
So
We're going to break, Professor Ratti, for about a quarter of an hour.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm asked to ask you if the break could, on this occasion, be for 20 minutes rather than 15.
Yes, of course, Mr. O'Connor. You're in the middle of it, Professor Ratti. You know the form well enough.
I do, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
Professor, before the break, we discussed your investigations and considerations relating to Dawn Sturgess's heart and whether there could have been any physical causation there. And then we also looked at the toxicology results. I want to move on now and ask you about your own consideration of the acetylcholinesterase levels within Dawn's body and also Novichok. And we have heard evidence that during her time in hospital, tests were undertaken which showed, first of all, severely depressed levels of acetylcholinesterase and also subsequently the presence of Novichok. And you were told that as part of her clinical history, were you not?
Yes, I gained access to that. So I gained access to the acetylcholinesterase results through the hospital notes, and I would have been informed also of those results and the presence of Novichok. So I came through two different routes.
Yeah. I'll take them separately. We'll talk first of all about the acetylcholinesterase. And before we get into it, is it right that you conducted your own tests attempting to establish that the acetylcholinesterase levels in Dawn's body as part of the autopsy process?
So not strictly the levels, sir. I tried to look and see of its presence and whether it was functional or not. So that's slightly different.
Let's go to the relevant paragraph of your conclusions, if we may. So it's in the full report, INQ 005227, page 35, please. And I think it's paragraph 16 that we need to be looking at for these purposes. Is that right, Professor?
That's correct, sir.
So let's take it in stages. You state at the outset of that paragraph that the immunohistochemistry examination for acetylcholinesterase undertaken at the EMFPU, is that the Birmingham establishment we talked about?
No, that's the shorthand version of the unit that I ran. So that's the East Midlands Forensic Pathology Unit, but we just, EMFPU, we just abbreviate it to, sir.
Right. So, well, that's helpful. Well, I'll finish the sentence, but so undertaken at the EMFPU demonstrated the presence of acetylcholinesterase in the samples examined. So it's clear from your explanation of what that acronym stands for that we are not now talking about tests taken during Dawn's life, but tests taken as part of the autopsy process.
Yeah, so these were tests done on two different sets of samples. So the first were appropriate tissue taken from Dawn herself, and then we also had to have control samples, and we very gratefully consented some relatives through another deceased individual to donate some tissue to us to assist with the investigation.
I see. Well, you refer to the control sample later in the paragraph. I was going to ask you about that, but that's helpful. Thank you. In summary then, what did these tests that you undertook tell you about Dawn's acetylcholinesterase levels?
Yeah, so we were trying to, so we looked at two different elements. We looked at the acetylcholinesterase and assuming that, and I do put that in very carefully, that the interpretation is correct, because this is not a test that we would normally undertake. We established that it was present, and then through a second test that it did not appear to be functional, and that's completely different. And that would be the pattern that you would expect with this particular agent. And then we also looked at the acetylcholine, which is what the acetylcholinesterase acts on, and we established that that was also present, and that appeared, compared to the control samples, to be present at a greater amount than the control. Again, that was a pattern that would be expected. And those were the tests that we did and the results that we acquired.
Yes, thank you. So we've heard other evidence about Novichok and other organophosphate poisons and their mechanism in the body. And as you say, the evidence that we have heard is, first of all, that the poison binds to the acetylcholinesterase enzyme and, as it were, disables it in the body. So I think what you've just said is you found that it was present but not functional.
That's correct, sir.
So that would be consistent with Novichok poisoning.
Correct, sir.
And then secondly, what we've heard is that in consequence of the suppression or disabling of the acetylcholinesterase, then the acetylcholine levels rise, which causes what we've heard described as the cholinergic toxidrome, the symptoms. But I think you've just said that your own tests demonstrated raised levels of acetylcholine in the body.
It supported, so we're comparing on post-mortem samples a control against Dawn, and there appeared to be an increase in staining. So I'm very careful in the way that I phrase it here and in the report, but that pattern supports what we would expect under these circumstances.
So just looking at this, is it the last sentence, the last 3 or 4 lines of this paragraph that we should be looking at for the acetylcholine testing? You said you'd chosen your words very carefully.
That's correct. So I premise the caution above and then explain the acetylcholine below.
And the words you use are that the immunohistochemical test undertaken to assess the presence of acetylcholine showed subjectively more positive staining for the test material than the control, and it is then hypothesized that this is the expected result, as Novichok should cause a build-up of acetylcholine.
That's correct. So we undertook no quantitative assessment. It's purely a looking down a microscope and doing, in essence, comparing a deceased tissue against deceased tissue and seeing a difference.
Yes. And just to be clear then, we'll come on to talk about tests for Novichok itself, but these tests that we've been discussing and which you describe in paragraph 16 got nothing to do with Novichok. They are simply looking at acetylcholinesterase and acetylcholine.
That's correct.
And so can you help us on would you say that these tests proved Novichok poisoning or were consistent with Novichok poisoning or something else?
So they are. So they don't prove Novichok poisoning because, in essence, those you would get the same pattern with in essence any organophosphate poisoning. It just shows a pattern that is expected by this particular agent's mechanism. So I can't say by looking at that was caused by Novichok, but it builds up a picture. And forensic pathology is all about putting lots and lots of different pieces of a puzzle together and then coming to a conclusion at the end of it.
Would you agree that the tests you undertook were at least consistent with Novichok poisoning?
Yeah, they're consistent and supportive, absolutely, but they don't tell you that it is. If you see, I think there's that's what I've just got to be. If I just got those results just like that, I couldn't turn around and say to you, "Oh, that's Novichok," without knowing that it was Novichok.
They're also, of course...
Is this right, Professor Rutte, at the simple soul? It supports inhibition of the acetylcholinesterase by something.
Yes, it supports the inhibition of acetylcholinesterase and the excess amount of acetylcholine.
And consequently too much acetylcholine. Thank you.
And for what it's worth, it also, those tests that you conducted, also consistent with the tests that were conducted during Dawn's life on her acetylcholinesterase levels.
Yeah, so in fairness, independently, because we independently assessed it and we came to the same conclusion in essence.
So that's acetylcholinesterase, and you've just described the tests that you yourself conducted in that regard. Turning then to Novichok, before we get into the detail, just a binary question. Did you actually conduct yourself test for Novichok in the same way as you had for acetylcholinesterase or not?
No, we didn't, and that's nothing unexpected because that's in essence a toxicological examination, and as with any toxicological examination, we would send appropriate samples to an appropriate laboratory that could undertake that work.
And as you say, then, as one would have expected, you received information from others about levels of Novichok in Dawn's body.
I did, sir.
And if we could look then at page 34 of the full report, so the same document we're looking at. First of all, if we could look at paragraph 14, so towards the bottom of that page. You say the DSTL report concerning the ante and post-mortem sample analysis informs me that Dawn Sturgess was poisoned with a Novichok nerve agent and that free intact Novichok was still present within her brain at autopsy.
Yes, sir.
The report itself is appended to your report, but is this one of the sources of information you received about the presence of Novichok in Dawn's system?
Yes, sir.
And then, looking down at the paragraph beneath that, paragraph 15, we referred, or we discussed, did we not, earlier, the presence of the independent observers from the Netherlands, who you subsequently discovered were from the OPCW at the autopsy.
Yes, sir.
And at paragraph 15, you say that you are aware, through the open source document produced by the OPCW, that they have independently confirmed the presence of a near pure, quotes, toxic chemical. Although to date, you say you've not been provided with a document which names this toxic chemical or provides you with any further information in relation to the samples that you provided to the OPCW at autopsy. That's the samples that we discussed earlier. You go on, although this document does not name the toxic chemical, it does state that the chemical is the same as that identified by the United Kingdom. Thus, on this basis, you've assumed that they too have identified the presence of Novichok.
That's correct, sir.
Let's look at that OPCW report, if we may. We looked at it briefly earlier. It's one of the appendices to your report. So if we could go within this document to page 67, please. This is the page we looked at before the break. Professor, we can notice about 4 or 5 lines down from the top the date, 4th of September 2018.
Yes, sir.
We looked earlier at the paragraphs on this page indicating that the team had come to the United Kingdom and attended the autopsy. If we could go over the page, please. We then see the results of the separate analysis conducted by the OPCW. If we look at paragraph 7, it indicates that the team was briefed on the identity of the toxic chemical identified by the United Kingdom. That is, as we've seen, DSTL identifying Novichok, yes?
Correct, sir.
And they go on, their team was able to review analytical results and data from the chemical analysis of biomedical samples collected from the affected individuals by the British authorities, and that includes the samples from Dawn's autopsy.
Yes, sir.
And then they indicate that the results, at paragraph 8, the results of the analysis of biomedical samples conducted by OPCW designated laboratories demonstrate that Mr. Charles Rowley and Ms. Dawn Sturgess were exposed to and intoxicated by this toxic chemical.
Correct, sir.
So is that the passage that you had in mind when you wrote that part of the report we were just looking at?
Yes, sir.
So we see, do we not, that the OPCW, having taken the sample away from the autopsy, conducted their own independent analysis of it?
That's as I understand it, yes, sir.
That's certainly what they say.
Yes.
And they they have their public conclusion, which they've expressed in this document, as you indicate in the report, doesn't name Novichok, but it does say that they agree with what the British government has said about the poisoning.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Just going back, if we may, to page 34 of this document, so back to your conclusions. So we've got to the point of the analysis where you are recording the fact that both DSTL and the OPCW, albeit in a slightly opaque way, have indicated the presence of Novichok. And is it fair to say that you then must consider whether Novichok is something that could explain the signs and symptoms shown by Dawn and ultimately could have been causative of her death?
Yes, sir.
And is that an issue that you address at paragraph 13 of your report?
I do, sir.
Now, we can see that there are some redactions to that paragraph. Let's just read through what's there. You say, I'm informed within the clinical notes and from Thames Valley Police, as well as DSTL, that the deceased has been exposed to Novichok. Picking it up after those next few words, you say, this, as I understand it, is thought to have been through a dermal exposure route following the application of the agent via a dispensing device. The inquiry has heard evidence about the different means of exposure to Novichok. We've heard about the dermal route, access through the skin, the fact that it causes, that takes some time. We also, in fact, heard some evidence that it's entirely possible that Dawn was exposed to the Novichok not only through her skin but also through inhalation. Is something that you had given any thought to?
Yeah, I think that's highly likely, considering the mode of dispensal, how it was likely applied, and then what she might have done, because I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that if you were applying something like a perfume or something like that, you might smell it. There'd also potentially be just some atmospheric liberation of it. And therefore, I've reflected upon this quite a lot in preparation. I think it's probably highly likely that it was also, in essence, breathed in nasally or orally. Yes, I think, although I do emphasise dermal, but yeah, I think that's probably highly likely.
And just taking that hypothesis on, assuming factually you're right that there was some inhalation as well as dermal exposure, what consequence would that have had physically?
So without straying outside my field of expertise, all I would suggest is that it's just an additional route into the body. So some drugs are, because in essence it's a drug or an agent, some are absorbed rapidly through the nasal membranes into the blood supply or into the lungs. So, but I think overall it means that she had more than one potential route of exposure.
Thank you. So reading on in the paragraph, you say, based on the known LD50 of VX, now just pausing there, yeah. LD50 is a way of describing a lethal dose, is it not?
Yeah, so 50% of, it's a lethal dose that will kill 50% of the subject, be it an animal or human.
So it's a benchmark.
It's a benchmark used commonly, by my understanding, when describing drug toxicity.
And then you've referenced VX, and we can see that you reference it further in that paragraph. Why are you referring to VX here as well as Novichok?
As a benchmark, so VX is another organophosphate chemical weapon, if you like to say like that, and there is more freely available information about it, both in the books that we held within the unit and within the accessible documents, whereas at the time that I wrote this, which is what I state in the report, I could only find 2 reference sources to help me considering Novichok. So I used it as a baseline, as another form of organophosphate poison.
Yeah. So just reading on, you say that if this was VX and not Novichok, then a single dispensing action could potentially deposit, and the words that come next have been concealed, but I can, do you agree with me that one way of gisting them would be to say, to add the words many times?
Yes.
Would that be fair? So to read it, it would read that a single dispensing action could potentially deposit many times the amount of material required to kill 50% of adults via a dermal route.
Yes, sir.
So going back to where I started, once you had the evidence that Novichok was in Dawn's body, you necessarily needed to consider what causative relevance, if any, that had. Is it a fair summary of this paragraph to say that, for the reasons you explain and the comparison with VX, that you consider that the Novichok poisoning is a sufficient explanation for the signs and symptoms that Dawn developed?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to go on to a different but related subject, which is the cause of the brain injury that Dawn sustained. And in fact, we can stick with this document, but go back to page 33, please. So I think it's the page before the one we were just looking at. I'd just like to look at, it's paragraph 10, Professor, where you express some views about this issue, is it not? Do you see that?
I do see that, yes, sir.
And you say this, due to the period of time that the deceased has survived post-ROSC, and we've heard that means the return of spontaneous circulation in hospital, and the time between death and the autopsy examination, the brain's consistency had deteriorated, making it difficult to examine at autopsy. Can you just expand on that briefly?
Yes, and I don't know if there are any relatives here, and I'm sorry for describing it, but basically, yeah, so she had suffered a global lack of oxygen, resulting in essence, the death of, in simplicity, the death of her brain, and therefore it would start to, well, it's died, and therefore its consistency will become softened and swollen within the head. And then after she's died, you have normal post-mortem decomposition starting. And because of that, the time period which is expressed in this report between her, not only between the incident, but between the death and when we had a chance to finally examine it, it had, shall we say, softened to the point where its removal and examination, well, the removal is difficult, and its examination meant that it was not a normal consistency.
So as you go on to say, is this right, that given what you've described, a better means of considering the brain, the condition of the brain and the development of the symptoms, rather than trying to examine it post-mortem, was to look at the CT scans that had been undertaken during Dawn's life?
Yeah, so there's very good clinical evidence there. So there's very, very good notes, CT scanning of both in life of the hypoxic injury, and the subsequent development was very good and obtainable, and it was time-stamped. It wasn't a single event, that we had sequential scans. But I think it was the right thing to have done, because you could say, well, why did we remove it? Well, the answer is we still had to prove that those were correct. And in fact, we also had to sample, and the samples were important.
Just reading on, you say, despite this, and this is the point you've just made, there are good clinical records in the form of the CT scans that demonstrate that Dawn's collapse was not as a result of an intracranial or intracerebral bleed. So, important point in terms of cause and effect.
Yes.
No doubt there are many cases broadly similar to this, where someone has collapsed and one is able to draw the conclusion that, in fact, something going on in their brain had caused the collapse.
Correct.
But is it right that what you're saying here is that that is not the position with Dawn Sturgess?
That's correct, yes.
And why not?
Well, because because of her age, there are really two big problems she could have had. First would be a stroke, in layman's terms, and the second was an intracranial bleed, which was raised at the time of her admission. They thought about that. The admission CT scans show that that didn't happen, and that the subsequent development of the changes in hospital, which are, like I say, timed, show that this is all attributable to basically her cardiac arrest and the subsequent problems developing afterwards.
So at very high level, rather than anything going wrong with the brain having caused the cardiac arrest, it's the other way round. Your view is it was the cardiac arrest and everything that went with it that caused the brain injury to develop in the days afterwards.
Yes, because one of her first presenting symptoms that I'm informed of is a headache. So, and a headache can be a indication of a intracranial bleed or possibly a problem with the brain itself. So again, I just wanted to consider that and look at natural explanations that could explain that, and in fact ultimately dismiss those.
And the conclusion you expressed then, if we can look at the end of this, the three lines at the end of this paragraph, you say, thus, you are of the opinion that the deceased has developed a post-cardiac arrest intracerebral bleed on a background of a hypoxic brain injury, which has extended to involve the vital cardiorespiratory centres of her brain and led to her death.
Correct, sir.
And you explain a bit more about that in your July statement from this year, which I'm going to take you to, and we'll look at several passages from that report. But before I do so, is it fair to say that, although we'll look at the further detail of your reasoning, that essential conclusion, or you tell me, has that essential conclusion changed or not?
No, sir.
Thank you. So with that in mind, let's go to the July statement, please. That's INQ 005818. And within that statement, page 8, please. Encouragingly, Professor, there is a subtitle which says layman's explanation.
Yes, and I produced a diagram as well, which I think actually explains it. I can work from and explain also should that be required.
Is that just let's try? Is that page? Let's go to page 5 of the report. Is that the diagram you had in mind? Page 5.
That's correct, sir.
Well, if it helps for you to use that diagram, can you explain the further reasoning in this report using that diagram?
Yes, so, you may wish to blow it up slightly because then I can.
I'm sure we can expand the middle section.
Right. So, in layman's terms, the sequence of events, as I understand it, is that Dawn Sturgess had a respiratory arrest, so she stopped breathing. So that will deprive her body of oxygen, and you can only sustain that for a short period of time before your heart stops, if it hadn't already stopped. So she's now in cardiorespiratory arrest, and she had a period of time between that happening and the first emergency services arriving, and that will have deprived her brain of any oxygen. And how long that is required, but many people, you hear stories of 4 minutes or a little bit longer. You don't need very long before your brain suffers a catastrophic injury. She then had a very prolonged period of resuscitation, combined with a post, and I'll use the term ROSC treatment. So that would further reduce her potentially the amount of oxygen going to her brain during resuscitation, and then post that she had a slow heartbeat, so that reduces. So her brain is suffering.
Just pause there, just to be clear.
Yes.
You've talked about the brain being starved of oxygen while the body was in cardiac arrest for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
I think you're saying that even once circulation returned, we've heard the reference to bradycardia, so slow heart rate during that period.
Yes.
Would that have, as it were, continued the deprivation of oxygen to the brain?
Yes, my understanding is she had a slow heartbeat and she had a low blood pressure, both of which will cause a reduction in oxygen, not only to her brain but to her whole body, but she will be continuing to have a reduced oxygenation. So she's going to suffer from a so-called hypoxic brain injury, an injury caused by a lack of oxygen. And this was confirmed, as I understand it, in hospital several days after her admission, when her brain function was showing minimal activity, and the CT scan at that point showed a global image of hypoxic brain injury. There then comes a next CT scan shows a bleed within the left-hand side of her brain. Now, I enclose the CT scans in my whole report, and for those, if you're looking at them, the bleed is in the area on this diagram, on the left-hand image, which is a slice through looking from the top downwards. When you read a CT scan, you look from the feet upwards. So that explains why I have circled it on the opposite side to the CT scan, but both are showing the left-hand area of the brain that is affected.
Yes.
And she had a delayed bleed into that area, which then expanded, and the diagram on your right-hand side shows the direction of the expansion of the blood towards the area of the brain that connects to the spinal cord, which is known as the brainstem, and in that area is where our principal areas which regulate breathing and your heart are the cardiovascular centres. And this, coupled with the reaction which will be going on because the brain will react to injury by swelling within a confined space, which unfortunately it only has a limited amount of expansion before it will try to expand outside the skull. This will compromise those areas, and ultimately she will have another cardiorespiratory arrest. So that is in essence the sequence. So it's a starvation of oxygen, the heart stops, a continued starvation of oxygen despite efforts to reverse that, a global injury which unfortunately proved irreversible, with a subsequent complication of a bleed that expanded into those areas.
Yes. Well, thank you, Professor. I think the only other passage I need to ask you about, given that explanation, if we can go on to page 9 of the report, please. This is the final part of your summary of this section. So it's the last paragraph here, starting at line 283. You say, for this hemorrhage to have occurred under the circumstances that it did, her brain had to have suffered hypoxic ischemic injury, i.e. an injury due to a lack of oxygen. That's what you've just described to us, I think. Yep. You say, I'm of the opinion that the cause of this insult was Novichok toxicity. first through respiratory depression. And just to be clear, we've heard about the cholinergic toxidrome, the different symptoms, the sort of paralysis of the diaphragm, the action, the heart itself. Are those the sort of signs you're talking about there?
Yeah, so it's affecting your breathing. There's too much fluid in your lungs. The paralysis of various muscles. Yes.
Yep. So you say that the respiratory depression caused by the Novichok toxicity would itself result in cerebral hypoxia, leading to cardiorespiratory arrest, as you've just explained. Then, through the hypoxia expected during prolonged CPR, and finally hypoxia which may be associated with post-cardiac arrest bradycardia. I think you've explained to us in the last few minutes all of those stages. Thus, the cerebral hypoxic ischemic injury need not be caused by the direct action of organophosphate on the brain, but rather the action of hypoxia caused by the effect of organophosphates on cardiorespiratory function, i.e. this pattern of cerebral hemorrhage is related to hypoxia-related cerebral injury, and hence has been reported post-cardiac arrest unrelated to organophosphate toxicity.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say there is that I don't, from my reading, I'm not saying that the Novichok caused the direct action on the brain itself, or cerebral hemorrhage is a consequence of Novichok. I mean, I have no published accessible documents to prove either way, but actually Novichok's having an adverse effect on your breathing and your heart, and therefore it stops those from functioning, and that's the point where it then triggers this sequence, the hypoxia, the cardiac arrest, etc. Yeah, so it is responsible for that, but I'm being careful of what part of the sequence I'm attributing to it, rather than saying that the action, by my understanding, is a direction on the cardiorespiratory function. It does have an effect on the brain, but not that.
And maybe that's what you're referring to, because we stopped reading before the very last sentence of this paragraph, because you go on to say, as the basal ganglia are reported to be susceptible to organophosphate-associated ischemic injury, and the bleed originated within the basal ganglia, then I'm of the opinion that this bleed, although not specific to Novichok, can be attributed as a late complication of Novichok toxicity.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
So I was really interested about why it was the basal ganglia, that area which I've circled on the diagram. Why that area and not another area of the brain? And there is both radiological and pathological reports in the literature that say for generically organophosphates, for which there are many poisonings across the world every year, that is the area of the brain that can be affected specifically under these circumstances. So therefore, to have a bleed at that point then becomes explainable. I was going to say not so surprising, but I think better to say that it becomes more explainable why that particular part of the brain is where with this particular case it bled. So it's not specific for Novichok because it could just be another pesticide.
I see.
But I can attribute it to being the late effect of the overall consequences of Novichok toxicity.
Thank you. So, Professor, that's all I wanted to ask you about, the specific, your reasoning and your analysis related to the brain injury. And I've taken you now through a number of the different areas of particular relevance in terms of your findings and causation and so on. And I'd just now like to go back to your full report, so that's INQ 005227, and simply take you through your conclusions relatively speedily, but just to ask you the extent to which they still stand. So if we go within that document to page 32, please. So we see the page there, and at the top there's a heading comments. And are these in fact your numbered conclusions?
They are, sir.
Which lead to your final conclusion as to the cause of death?
Yes, sir.
We can see, and I'm not going to go through them in any detail, that the first 3 paragraphs, the numbered paragraphs 1, 2 and 3, is really a summary of the clinical history that you were told about and that you read from the documents.
Yeah, they're just standard summaries of other parts of the document, sir.
The paragraph 4 is a summary of the factual circumstances of the autopsy.
Yes, sir.
Paragraphs 5, and if we can scroll down to the next page, 6 and 7, are a summary of your findings in relation to the external examination of Dawn's body.
Yes, sir.
And of course, the detail is contained in the body of the report. We've looked at some of the paragraphs. Paragraph 8 is a summary of your findings in relation to the internal examination of Dawn's body.
Yes, sir.
And then paragraph 9, let's look at that, records, does it not, your conclusions about those different inspections and investigations?
Yes, sir.
And you say no natural disease was identified at the autopsy examination or the subsequent histological or cardiac examinations to account for the presenting signs and symptoms or to be considered as her cause of death.
Correct, sir.
Does that remain your conclusion?
Yes, sir.
Paragraph 10 relates to your analysis relating to the brain injury, and in particular, we've looked at this only a few minutes ago, and I took you to the last sentence where you express the opinion relating to a post-cardiac arrest intracerebral bleed. Does that sentence remain as your conclusion, albeit with the added benefit of the explanation in your July report?
Yes, sir.
So if we could go over the page. Paragraph 11 is a subject we haven't touched on so far. It relates to, as we can see, fluid accumulations within Dawn's pericardial sac and other cavities. Can you briefly explain what this paragraph is about, please?
Yeah, so in essence, I say that there was fluid within 3 cavities, which I, in essence, summarise as being non-specific, although I am aware that fluid accumulation, particularly in the lung, is reported in general in relation to organophosphate toxicity. As you commonly see these findings under other circumstances at autopsy, I don't attribute them to specifically being related to Novichok, although I can't exclude that, and therefore I say that ultimately I consider them as being non-specific.
So they are findings in the sense you have seen things which are not normal, but you do not regard them as being significant in terms of explaining Dawn's death.
They're not the cause of her death. They're observations, and I'm just giving an opinion as to why they're there.
Thank you. Moving on, paragraph 12 relates to the toxicology results taken during Dawn's life. We've talked about that, and I think you've already agreed that final sentence of that paragraph, I'm not aware there is any indication to suggest that the deceased's collapse was a direct result of the action of either a therapeutic or illicit drug. With the added explanation you've given today and in your later report, does that remain your conclusion?
Yes, sir.
Paragraphs 13, 14 and 15 we have looked at. They relate to the evidence of Novichok in Dawn's body and your conclusions about that. And I asked you earlier whether you had concluded that what you understood to be the evidence of Novichok in Dawn's body was a sufficient cause to explain the signs and symptoms that she had experienced. And I think you said you agreed that they were.
I do, sir.
Thank you. Moving on to the next page, paragraph 16 is one we have been looking at very recently about your own tests for acetylcholinesterase and acetylcholine. And I think the way you put it was that those tests were consistent with Novichok poisoning, although not probative of it.
Yes, sir.
And then the final paragraph, paragraph 17, you say, thus, I am of the opinion that the clinical presentation, in terms of the signs and symptoms, as well as the in-life laboratory tests and reports received following the autopsy examination, all support that Dawn Sturgess did not collapse or die from a natural medical event, an assault, or the result of a therapeutic or illicit drug overdose, but rather due to the complications resulting from a cardiac arrest caused by Novichok toxicity. Having been exposed to the nerve agent Novichok, which appears from the information I have been provided to have occurred through a dermal exposure route, and with the knowledge of the expected action of organophosphate nerve agents, I would have expected Dawn Sturgess to have deteriorated relatively quickly. It's documented that she first went into respiratory arrest and then asystolic cardiac arrest. Although CPR was successful and resulted in a ROSC, she continued to exhibit organophosphate toxicity post-ROSC. Although her cardiac function did begin to show some improvement, she had sustained severe hypoxic brain injury, which developed into an intracerebral hemorrhage. The intracerebral hemorrhage then extended into the vital cardiorespiratory areas of her brain, and this was the final pathological process that, in my opinion, led to her death. And then you give immediately below that, in bold, cause of death, and this, you'll agree, is a summary of that paragraph I've just read. 1A, post-cardiac arrest, hypoxic brain injury, and intracerebral hemorrhage. 1B, Novichok toxicity.
Yes, sir.
And do those remain your conclusions, Professor?
Yes, sir.
May I ask how confident you are of those conclusions?
Oh, gosh. Well, as confident as I can be. I suppose at the end of the day, the cause of death is always a suggestion, because it's the totality of the evidence that is heard by the coroner or the person undertaking that role, who may have access to other material. But from a pathological point of view, I've identified no other reason to explain her death.
Thank you. Professor, those are all the questions I wanted to ask you, as it were, with your pathologist hat on, about the cause of Dawn's death. But there is, as you'll recall, you mentioned right at the outset, just the question of those two short statements that you provided to the police, which take you onto a slightly different piece about the use of atropine in pre-hospital treatment. And I want to ask you, finally, just for a few minutes, some questions about that. So if we can, for those purposes, first of all, go to the first of those two statements. So it's the 11th of November 2019, INQ 004495. We've looked at this statement briefly already. If we can go over to the second page, please. We looked, Professor, at the very top. We noted that you'd been requested to provide a supplementary statement addressing the use of atropine in cardiac arrest, and then we also looked at the line underneath the word comments, which gave a bit more detail about the question you'd been asked. That is, whether Dawn Sturgess would or could have survived had she been given atropine during CPR, and the paragraphs below set out your opinion on that matter. The first paragraph, it provides important, no doubt, but detail about the guidelines and so on that were in play. And then the substance of your opinion on this matter is contained in the subsequent paragraphs, which I will read. You say that, I'm looking at paragraph 2 now, the Resuscitation Council guidance does support the use of atropine in the pre-arrest situation where the patient is bradycardic, i.e. has a slow pulse rate, and is experiencing adverse features. Those features are shock, syncope, myocardial ischemia, or heart failure. And then you say, thus, had medical assistance arrived prior to Dawn Sturgess going into cardiac arrest and found her to be bradycardic with adverse features, then the use of atropine would have been appropriate.
Yes.
You then move on in the next paragraph to the situation following cardiac arrest and following successful CPR. You say once a patient has had a return of spontaneous circulation, ROSC, following CPR, it's not unusual for them to be initially bradycardic. However, although atropine can be used at this stage, it is used with caution. Thus, we do not routinely give atropine with a ROSC, but rather use adrenaline in measured doses to increase blood pressure. And you give some more detail about that. And at paragraph 4, your conclusion then is that having stated that post-ROSC atropine could then have been used at this stage, as she, that is Dawn, remained bradycardic, her principal problem resulting in her death was related to post-hypoxic brain injury following prolonged cardiac arrest. Of course, you've explained that in some detail this morning. This problem would not, to my knowledge, be improved by the use of atropine, as the critical damage to her brain caused by oxygen starvation during prolonged cardiac arrest was already established. So, just taking a step back, in fact, in those paragraphs, you were addressing two questions. First, about the appropriateness of administering atropine at various stages of presentation before and after cardiac arrest. And we've seen what you have to say about that. And then, in that final paragraph, you turn to the question which you'd particularly been asked about chances of survival. And, well, in summary, what was your view about whether the administration of atropine or not would have affected her chances of survival?
Well, I don't. So I'm just thinking particularly about paragraph 4, because what I've said today is that obviously part of the hypoxic brain injury is actually, in part, could certainly be contributed by the bradycardia. So I suppose you could argue, sitting here thinking about it, that giving atropine to relieve a bradycardia would therefore increase oxygen delivery to the brain, but a prolonged bradycardia, which is what I understood she had, the atropine's actually not doing anything. So giving the atropine certainly during cardiac arrest is neither part of the normal algorithm and wouldn't, by no knowledge, assisted. And correct me if you're wrong, I think she was, well, whether she was given atropine or not post-ROSC, if she was, it didn't actually help because she remained in prolonged bradycardia.
I don't think we've heard evidence, but I don't think, in fact, there is any evidence that she was given atropine following ROSC.
But that's, like I say, I mean, as I've said higher up, it's not part of the normal algorithm or part of the normal treatment, because you have to weigh the consequences of doing that. And the more standard treatment would be actually to give her adrenaline or other blood pressure increasing drugs.
Yes.
By not giving it, actually, and you'd have to give it in such huge volumes because of the problem that she's experienced because of the toxicity of Novichok, that actually I think the damage was already done. And that's because of the prolonged period of time between cardiorespiratory arrest and getting the ROSC.
And we will hear other evidence on those matters, Professor, so I'm not going to explore that any further with you. But I'm going to ask that we look now at that second short statement that you prepared a few days later. So that is INQ 004496. We'll see it was the 21st of November. If we go straight to page 2, and you'll remember I looked at this at the very start of your evidence. There you were requested to provide further explanation. Obviously, your first statement hadn't answered the questions that the police had. And, Professor, it's right, isn't it, that in this statement you focus on the use of the pens, the auto-injectors. We've heard in this case about the Duodote pens, which inject both atropine and also prolidoxine. And you are commenting on the appropriateness of using them at particular times during a presentation such as Dawn's. If we can go down to the bottom of page 2, please. There's a paragraph at the very bottom of that page. You say, as I understand it, an auto-injector should be used after an individual is exposed to nerve agents or organophosphate poisoning, where they are experiencing symptoms. The number of pens to be used, going over to the next page, depends upon the degree of symptoms experienced. The auto-injector should be used as soon as possible, especially if severe life-threatening symptoms are present. Then this sentence, reviewing the information sheets related to 3 types of auto-injectors, referenced below. And if we could just drop down, we see just underneath references, you've referred, is this right, to, they're all links to websites, but to 3 of these auto-injectors. The first one appears to be the Duodote pen that we have had some more evidence about. Yep. So just going back up to that sentence, so you have reviewed those information sheets, and then you go on to say, none indicate that an auto-injector should be used when a patient has gone into cardiac arrest.
That's correct, sir.
So that is an absence in any of those information sheets suggesting that it is appropriate to use that device when someone is in cardiac arrest.
Yeah, and prior to coming here, I've spent a lot of time preparing for this over the last 3 weeks, and I've revisited these auto-injector, and I still can find no site suggesting their use during cardiac arrest.
And then, so just then applying that to the facts of Dawn's case, if we look at the paragraph below, you say, thus, from my understanding of the use of auto-injectors, had the emergency services arrived whilst Dawn was alive, conscious or unconscious, and exhibiting the effects of nerve agent exposure, but had not gone into cardiorespiratory arrest, and they had realised that she'd been exposed to a nerve agent, then the use of an auto-injector would be appropriate to attempt to block the effects of the nerve agent and assist with her clinical management.
Yes, sir.
Pausing there, first of all, we've heard evidence, in fact, that is exactly what happened with Charlie Rowley later that day. Paramedics did arrive while he was in fact still conscious. They diagnosed nerve agent poisoning and used a Duodote injector pen on him. Of course, the position was different with Dawn because when she was already in cardiac arrest when the paramedics arrived. So that does not apply to the facts of her case, does it?
No, sir.
And so reading on, you say, however, if the paramedics arrived when she was already in cardiorespiratory arrest, which on the facts we know was the case, and were unaware of her exposure to a nerve agent, then, as stated in my previous statement, I would have expected them to have followed normal adult advanced life support procedures, which does not have atropine as a drug to be used at that stage. And then taking it on a stage, once a return of spontaneous circulation was achieved and the realisation that she had persistent bradycardia and may also have been exhibiting other symptoms of nerve agent exposure, at that point the use of atropine, as I understand it, would be appropriate.
Yes, sir.
And so the last statement we need to go to on this, and this takes us back right to the beginning of evidence when you said there was one issue that you wanted to correct, and I did promise we would come back to it, is the July statement, please, INQ 005818, page 16. And if we can go to the bottom sort of third of that page, starting at line 525. So that this paragraph starting in my second supplementary report, that's the report we've just been looking at, isn't it, Professor?
Yes, there's actually another paragraph which you all may have. There's 2 paragraphs. There's one here, and I think there's one earlier on, where I basically just got word blinded to reading all these reports.
Well, double negatives are difficult things.
And I was under the impression that I had previously suggested that actually in cardiac arrest you should use one of these pens, because I missed the word none after the brackets. And therefore I wrote this paragraph and one earlier, basically saying that I'd previously said that. I've reread all the documentation. I can't find where the reference to that was, and therefore I changed my mind that you shouldn't use. Well, there's no indication that you should use these pens, whereas in fact, actually, I remain of that opinion, and it's simply a misreading of a single word in one of my earlier reports.
So actually, you never had said that in the first place.
Absolutely, sir, and I apologise.
That's how I read it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But on the glass half full analysis, Professor, you have in effect done some more research to confirm the earlier view that you expressed.
Yes, I double checked what I said, reread everything, and I stand by my original statements that I can find no protocol or suggestion that these should be used during a person who is in cardiac arrest as being exposed to, I'll just use the generic term, organophosphate.
Yes. And then just very finally on this, and just people may be recalling some evidence we heard a couple of weeks ago now about the protocol that was in force in 2018 for the duodope pen that was in fact used. If we can go to INQ 000623, please. As I say, we looked at this during the hearings in Salisbury, but this is the medicines protocol for the duodope pen issued in January 2017, but then effective for 2 years after that, so covering June 2018. I won't go all the way through it, Professor, but if we can go over to the second page. First of all, I don't know if you have had a chance to look at this.
I have read it, yes.
And it's right, then you'll agree with me that exactly as you say in your statement, there is nothing in here which positively encourages the use of the pen while someone is in cardiac arrest.
So there's nothing here. There is nothing currently either on the National Ambulance, which is the JR Calc guidelines to which all ambulance services work to, and I've reread those as well, and I've not found anything to suggest that.
No. What there is, which rather at least puts a gloss on it, perhaps indicating certainly caution about the use of these pens where there are cardiac issues in play. So if we just look at the second bullet point of the sort of large lower box of this table, where we see on the left-hand side cautions. So one of the circumstances in which caution should be exercised is when symptoms of poisoning are not severe. Duodope should be used with extreme caution in people with heart disease, arrhythmias, recent myocardial infarctions, and so on. So this is slightly to one side. It's not telling you positively to use it or definitely not to use it, but it is indicating that where there are cardiac issues, certainly caution should be applied.
Yeah, exactly. It's the use of any drug is not without hazard, and they're expressing the diseases which you've got to be really wary about when the person is still alive.
Thank you very much, Professor. Those are all the questions I wanted to ask you on that slightly separate issue about atropine. And indeed, that's the end of my questions. There may or may not be some further questions for you, Professor.
Are there no any others? No, you seem to have covered the ground, Professor Ratti.
Thank you, sir.
On this last point that you've been asked about, the possible or theoretical possibility of using atropine or any of these other duodate or whatever at different times, I understand what you said. You've been very thorough, but in any event, had any of those things been used, would it have had any impact on the process which you think is the mechanism of death? That is to say, cardiac arrest leading to hypoxic brain injury, leading to brain intracranial bleeding.
So I think if, through my understanding of this particular death, the agent involved and its administration, I think that there is, I think had a pen been used, I think there are two problems. I think I don't think it, by my reading, I don't think that it would have had any material effect.
No.
I'll explain that for two reasons. First of all, the atropine side, I think, would have been, although it had been at the right dose, it would have been its effect would have just been overwhelmed by the build-up of acetylcholine. And in terms of the pralidoxine, which I've explained within one of the other reports, I think the agent would have, there's this term which you may have or may have not covered or be covered, which is this term aging, where it changes rapidly, and I don't think it necessarily would have had any effect. So I think the use of a single pen would have made no, by my understanding, no material difference.
I see. All right, well, thank you very much. We can let you go, I think, Professor Ratty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your help. And that, I dare say, Mr. O'Connor, is a convenient point to break, is it?
It is so, yes.
How much of this afternoon are we likely to need? Most of it?
Yes.
Well, then, in that case, we'll make a start as soon as we can. 1:45, please. And we can resume, can we, with our various devices if we wish.
Yes, we'll be in level 1 at that stage.
Level 1. Right. Thank you very much indeed for coming, Professor.